Chapter 3 in AP Environmental Science is going to deal with ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? Eco, remember, means Earth, so that's kind of how these systems work together. Little case study to start. Tropical rainforest, by the way, the largest remaining tropical rainforest is in the country of Brazil. Currently, tropical rainforests only cover about 2% of the Earth's land surface. Why do we really care about it? Well, the reality is it contains about 50% of our world-known plant and animal species. Think about this. What if there is something in our jungles that has the cure for heart disease, for things like cancer? We need that stuff around. Lots of species are becoming extinct in the tropical rainforests and around the planet because of things like deforestation. We're getting rid of things before we even discover them. Anyway, what's happening is we have major harmful effects of this disruption. We reduce biodiversity. We accelerate global warming. What happens as you cut down a tree has a large amount of carbon in it. It's called carbon sequestration. It holds it, or a carbon sink. And what happens is we cut that tree down, it is going to prematurely release that carbon back in the atmosphere. Changes regional weather patterns. It can actually change the amount of humidity in the area. It becomes drier without the vegetation holding it in. It can also reduce things like wind patterns for that matter. So major life support systems that we need to worry about, there's 4 of them. First of all, the atmosphere. There's many layers of the atmosphere, but we're going to focus really on 2. The first one is the troposphere. You are sitting, standing, laying down, whatever you're doing right now in the troposphere is where our weather occurs. Those clouds that are up and around you right now, that is in the troposphere. That's where you fly a kite, if you still do fly kites. Stratosphere, a very important layer. It contains ozone. What the ozone layer does is it prevents UV radiation from coming in and literally burning us up. Second major component is something called the hydrosphere. Hydro means water. It's the water on the Earth's surface that could be even that trapped in ice. It could be that of the oceans. It could be fresh water. That is very critical to us, obviously, because we are made up of about 70% water. Geosphere is, geo means Earth, so it's the solid Earth. We'll talk a little bit about that down the road, particularly when we talk fossil fuels and the fact that we get our nutrients, but also our fossil fuels from the crust layer. Biosphere, bio means living. That is all the life on the planet. That includes us. That includes all the deer, the squirrels, the raccoons, the plants, the little protists, everything. We all interact together. We have a one-way flow of high-quality energy that starts from the sun. Of course, the sun is everything. Without the sun, we wouldn't be warm. We also wouldn't have life in general, because what happens is the sun, if you can follow this little pattern on here, goes to the plants. The plants absorb about less than 1% of the sun they use for photosynthesis, but those plants also sustain us living things. They give us glucose and oxygen. It also keeps our environment warm. Some of it is radiated back into space, but a lot of it is absorbed into the earth and then released later, combines with greenhouse gases and keeps us warm. Otherwise, we'd be a cold, lifeless planet. Cycling of nutrients through parts of the biosphere, we're going to get to that a little later. What happens is we've got things like nitrogen, phosphates, sulfur, and everything that cycles through. Water cycle is another one. We need that in order to live. Again, more detail coming later. Of course, gravity holds the Earth's atmosphere. What happens is the gravity pulls molecules down. So the more dense regions are actually at sea level, and the higher you go up, what happens is we don't have quite the strong gravitational pulls, so we have less density up in our atmosphere. The ecosystem has several important components. First of all, the study of ecology is the science of organisms' interactions with each other in their non-living environment. There are 2 key terms, biotic and abiotic. Biotic are all the living components, all the plants and animals, protists. The non-living things, the abiotic factors, are things that affect us. They tend to be things like temperature, wind, nutrients. Ecologists study interactions within and among. We start at the organism level. If you think back to biology, if you take a look at the chart, biology class probably dealt a lot with atoms, molecules, and cells. Well, we kind of start with ecology there and up. An organism, for example, is an individual living thing. That one deer that lives outside your house that's eating your parents' flowers, that is an organism. A bunch of deer together make up a population. Think about even us. You make up the population of the state you live in or the region you live in. Then we throw in communities. Communities are populations of different species in a particular place and potentially interacting with one another. You very much interact with the other living components of your community. You interact with the deer population. You interact with all the animals. Even if you have a dog or cat, obviously you interact with those too. Ecosystem is a step up even further. That's all the populations interacting with the non-living parts of the environment. The number of nutrients that are available to you is part of our ecosystem. Your climate is part of your ecosystem. And then if we think big picture, biosphere, bio again means living. It's parts of the earth's air, water, and soil where life is found. We have several important components within our ecosystem. First of all, producers. Producers are also known as autotrophs. They can photosynthesize or make energy on their own. They could also go through something called chemosynthesis too, but photosynthesis is when plants are photosynthesizing bacteria or protists, combine carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and they give us two magical things, glucose and oxygen. Consumers. We are consumers, also known as heterotrophs. We are primary, rather consumers, which are herbivores. What that means is producers, think of this, think about a field of grass. What's going to happen is that grass is going to be the autotroph. Then what's going to happen is a deer is going to come along, which is a heterotroph, and start eating that grass. Well, that deer is a primary consumer. It's an herbivore. Cows are herbivores too. Secondary consumer is if you ate that cow, then you would be deemed a secondary consumer. Tertiary consumers are top of the food chain, and what a tertiary consumer would be is generally don't have a lot of predators at all. They're things like hawks and eagles, and we are examples of that. Sharks are example of that, where it doesn't really get any higher than us. Tertiary means end. Also, don't forget about those magical words you learned back when you studied dinosaurs in 3rd grade. Carnivores are anything that eats meat only. Omnivores eat both meat and plants, and of course herbivores eat only plants. A couple examples of some producers: big trees, big grasses in that upper left picture, and don't forget about pond. Things like algae are also producers, and algae are kind of a generic way of just saying a bunch of photosynthesizing consumers. Oh, lovely picture here. Consumer is anything that eats something else and cannot make its own energy. So it cannot photosynthesize or make energy on its own. That is consumer. Decomposer is a very important part of our food webs and food chains. They are consumers that release nutrients. Decomposers are, hang on to this one, bacteria and fungi generally. What they do is break nutrients down, or dead and decaying things down back into their individual nutrient components and put it back into our environment. It's kind of the cycle of life. Detrivores tend to be a little confusing. They feed on dead bodies of other organisms. Generally, they're little things like beetles and worms, that creepy crawly little things. Centipedes, millipedes would be an example of this. Keep in mind, in nature we have very little waste. You can actually, examples of detrivores right here, the beetles, the carpenter ants are example. What they do is they break big stuff into little stuff, and then bacteria and fungi will break it down even into further nutrient. A couple ways of looking at how creatures get their energy. There's aerobic respiration and anaerobic. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen to turn glucose back to carbon dioxide and water. So again, a complete cycle. Remember, a photosynthesizing plant will make that glucose and oxygen, and then us, for example, will use or take that oxygen and glucose, make that into ATP, which is the little adenosine triphosphate that makes energy for us. And as a byproduct, we get carbon dioxide and water. That's what you breathe out. Anaerobic respiration can go a couple different ways. Fermentation is an example. Anaerobic is without oxygen. So fermentation occurs with this. End products are carbon compounds such as methane or acetic acid. Really in this class we'll talk about things like swamps. So when we do solid waste, we'll talk about landfills, and what they do is they use anaerobic processes, anaerobic bacteria, to break down dead and decaying stuff in landfills, and release methane as a result. Food chain versus food web. Food chain, movement of energy and nutrients from one trophic level to the next. Very simple. Photosynthesis to feeding to decomposition is kind of a simplistic way to think about it. But a food chain would be, we've got this little grass right here, and then we've got this rabbit right here, the rabbit with its big ears, and what they're going to do is the rabbit is going to eat that. So what we have here is a primary consumer, and then what happens is we have this big hawk up here, and that hawk's going to come down and eat that. That is a secondary consumer. That's a simple food chain. Food webs are much better because they show interconnected chains. This is an example of a food web. Now, why it's better? If you take a look at this carnivorous zooplankton, for example, the fish are going to eat it. These penguins are going to eat it. These squid are going to eat it. In a true food chain, it's only going to show a series, but this is going to show interaction among many things and how realistically, in this case, a zooplankton is eaten by things. A couple key words as we look at these different pyramids. Biomass, first of all, think about dry weight of all organic matter in a given trophic level or a food chain or food web. Biomass is if you took a deer, for example, and all the water out of it, that's its dry mass. That's how much biomass it has. This decreases at each level, again, because we lose energy at each step, as you can see in the energy pyramid to the right. The pyramid shows a 90% loss of energy with each level. We've got producers on the bottom. We've got 10,000 kilocalories, for example, on the bottom here. And we've got phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are photosynthesizing little protists. And what happens is zooplankton is going to eat the phytoplankton. Only 10% of the energy carries up to the next step because there's a lot of waste. Zooplankton, like us, are not 100% efficient creatures. They produce a lot of waste. Where it really comes into play, a little bit easier to understand, is if we have something like perch, which is a really good fish to eat, and we have humans, what happens is, again, only 10% carries through because us humans are warm-blooded creatures. A lot of that energy actually goes to keeping us warm. A lot of it, because our body can't process that energy quick enough, or that biomass quick enough, what happens is we lose it as waste, as feces. So only 10% carries through. We're not really efficient creatures. Gross primary productivity, next slide is going to be net primary productivity. Very important words. Gross primary productivity. Think of gross in this regard. If you have a job and you make $400 in a couple weeks, do you get that $400? Absolutely not. That would be your gross take-home pay, but the old government takes a few bucks out of there for you. Gross primary productivity is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy to chemical energy and biomass. So it is how it takes the sun's rays and creates that glucose and oxygen. Now, if you look at the eastern part of the United States, we have very high gross primary productivity, much higher in the tropical rainforest. There's a lot more plants, thus there's a lot more animals / consumers there. Now, that's gross primary productivity. Think about this. Plants make glucose and oxygen. They don't make it necessarily for us. They make it for themselves because they go through respiration. What's left over, we get. Net primary productivity, rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy to chemical energy, that's gross, minus the rate at which producers use energy for aerobic respiration. So plants need to use that that gross energy they make and go through their own cellular respiration. Well, what happens is the leftovers basically we get. This little chart is very important. We know in regions like swamps and marshes and tropical rainforests and temperate forests like the region we live in, we have very high NPP. What that translates to is we have a lot of other animals that can live here. If you go down to extreme desert, desert scrub, tundra, they don't have a lot of plant matter. Just not great regions for those to grow. A lack of precipitation is a huge limiting factor there. They don't have a high NPP. In aquatic regions, something you'll need to know, estuaries, believe it or not, where fresh and saltwater meet, we have very high NPP. Lots of plants and animals live in that region. Now, they do have to adjust to different salinity levels and different temperature levels, but there's a very high NPP there. Lakes and streams, quite a bit. A lot of animals live in there, a lot of fish. Open ocean, not so much. Open ocean doesn't have a lot of primary productivity because they don't have the nutrients coming from offshore. And there's some other factors in there too. They get things like phytoplankton in there, but that's about it. They just don't have the nutrient level. So that's it for the first lecture of Chapter 3.